Hello and welcome to part 4 of this series. In this part, as you can see, I've adopted the Visual Studio white theme, and I've bumped it up to 14-point font, so this is in response to some requests that I've gotten to do just this. So hopefully it's a little more viewable for everybody. Now I'm going to start out here with something I borrowed from a book by Kent Beck that I read a long time ago, Test-Driven Development by Example. And it's not exactly what he does in this book. This is my own modification of it. It's a little Excel and color intensive, but basically what I start to do as I'm implementing a project that isn't completely trivial is I realize I'm not going to get to every single thing that I want to do all at once. Things occur to me as I'm coding and I think to myself, oh, that's not good, but I don't want to break my train of thought. I'll worry about that later. I've come to this as a compromise for a sort of non-invasive way to say, okay, I'm not going to stop and actually implement this thing, but I'm going to make a note of it. And I call it things I don't like. It may be that I'm being a bit hard on myself or, I don't know. It's just a way of getting myself into the frame of mind. There's a bunch of stuff I don't like about this code, but you know what? Following the test-driven development practice, that's okay. You're going to fix all of these things later. Test-driven development is all about creating small tasks that are solvable. So here are some things right off the top that I don't like. One is code rush issues, code rush being my productivity tool. And it's telling me when you see squigglies under things here, often that's code rush saying, hey, there's a problem with this class. Another thing that I want to do is I want to pull all of these inline classes that I have, test class and production class together. I want to start separating those because number one, that's a code rush issue. And number two, it's not what I eventually want to be doing. It's nice when you're first creating things because it's quick to edit them that way, but eventually it gets annoying. So what you're seeing me do here is kind of knock out the code rush issues one by one. And one code rush issue in C# is it says, hey, you should only have one type per file. So in order to achieve one of these goals that I have, the broader goal of code rush issues, I have to go and I have to move them into their own files. And what I'm doing here for the time being is I'm creating, instead of a whole separate project, I think it'll be quicker and generally easier for me until it becomes unwieldy to have this just in one project. But what I will do to keep things organized is create a separate namespace that I'm going to call production. And not surprisingly, that's where the production code goes. So what I'm doing here is messing around with kind of moving all of these things in as quick a way as possible into this production folder. And some of the things I'm doing here are what you've seen before, which is trying to get the type to match the file or the file to match the type. In that particular case, I struggled a bit because I guess there's no shortcut to my surprise for code rush to do that with a struct as opposed to a class. So I fumble a little there, but what I'm doing now is I'm moving this into a new namespace, and then I have to go back into the test classes and update the usings via control period. And when I'm doing a refactoring like this, typically I rely on a technique called leaning on the compiler. And what that is I make some changes, then I hit Control-Shift-B and see what breaks, and then I go fix that rather than kind of scrolling or moving through the files or something looking for squigglies. I just let the compiler tell me what's not working. So what I'm going to need to do here is get all of my namespaces squared away and keep trying to build and see what happens, see what's wrong. Instead of fixing this one, I'm just going to move it to the namespace as needed. So it's in that folder, and then I have to update the namespace on it. And once I do that, the dependencies it has on the other classes in the production folder should get resolved. So I'm going to keep building and keep seeing what is and isn't compiling and hopefully get everything straightened out. And as I go along, probably when I see things here, I'm invoking the code rush menu shortcut to sort of see what's wrong and hopefully in one fell swoop correcting some of these issues as well as getting things compiling and organized. So there it was a question of adding usings. Now I'm going to see what is going wrong still. And if memory serves, I just needed to do a rebuild or something. I was getting a false positive here with the non-compiling, so it took me a minute to figure that out. But then I did, rebuilt, and in the meantime got rid of unused using statements and was good to go with one more correction to make. Control period should take care of that. And now I should have a compiling code base. And one thing I should mention is you can rely a lot on these ncrunch dots if you're using ncrunch. When things aren't compiling, in the lower right corner, you'll see a yellow circle. And more visually, you will start to see the dots, just as they did a second ago, go from a lighter to a darker color. When they go dark, and they're stronger, I should say, this is when you know that things are compiling again. So I am working my way through these files, eliminating all of the different issues. Here is an issue that I'm about to figure out is being caused by this class using no fields and not being called static. That's something CodeRush flags. It wants you to label methods as static if they aren't using any class fields, but I get around that by labeling it virtual, which I'm going to want it to be soon anyway, and we'll come back to that shortly. So I'm going through and just knocking out all of these different issues so that I can go into my spreadsheet and say, hey, this is done. And I can also mark this one as done as well. Now, what I'm going to do is, while I'm in here and have sort of broken my train of thought, I'm going to think briefly about a couple of other things I might like to see, such as the production code going in its own actual project. We're not going to have these things mixed together when all is said and done, but that's something I'm not going to do right now. And let's see, there's some things about pawn that we might want to improve upon here. For instance, the idea that it doesn't implement en passant, and also maybe the idea that it doesn't do a diagonal capture. Those are more complicated concepts that I don't exactly know how I want to implement at this point, but I do know that I want to and need to implement them. So maybe I'll come back to that later. I think I have other things that I'd like to move on to here at the moment. So I'm going to have these guys as yellow and then think briefly about what else we might like to do. So I think maybe the next thing that it makes sense to tackle here, I'll close out all these documents, was item number 2 on the list, which is that the board is taking pawn as an argument instead of piece. It's not going to be a very interesting chess game if the only pieces that we can use are pawns. So now is the time to think, how do we go about getting this to deal with piece instead of pawn? So if I look at the class pawn, what I actually want to do is see if I can find a way to use CodeRush, there we go, to create an ancestor of this class, because I think I want pawn to inherit from something called piece. And I'm going to engage this as a refactoring. Technically, I might want to actually be creating a non-compiling or non-functioning test situation in order to do this, but this might be a bit of a gray area because I'm simply doing a refactoring, and then I'm going to verify once this compiles that everything is still going to be green. So if I'm fudging it a little bit, forgive me here, but I think I'm generally sticking to the spirit of the discipline. So what I want to do is just say that we have this class, this base class, in which this method is defined, but we're still going to leave the implementation in place, which is still going to have the test passing and all that. So I'm going to say that I have an abstract method called getMovesFrom, and I'm going to have it use the same signature, obviously, as the child class that I've had this overriding. And now it looks like this isn't compiling. And if memory serves, that's probably because this class needs to be abstract. Yes, that's it. And CodeRush was good enough to tell me right in line. So now it compiles and the tests are still green, so the refactoring was successful. Now at this point, I'm going to actually have to create failing tests once I move the piece into its own file. I'm going to have to, in order to make this item complete, actually create failing tests, because now I want to go and change the way board works. It's going to take a piece instead of a pawn. So I'm going to have to figure out some kind of failing test to write in order to make that happen. And it might even wind up being sort of an obtuse test. Oftentimes, it's not necessarily easy to think of a really functional test you want to make, something like using a child class instead of a base or vice versa. It's a little awkward to write a test that does that. So I spent a little bit of time kind of thinking, all right, what sort of test should I write here? So what I'm going to do is define a new test. And basically, I'm just going to say that I'm going to have another type here. And this is in an attempt to make this somewhat useful. I haven't defined rook yet, but board is going to need to accept another type as argument, and rather than do some odd type manipulation or something like that, I'll just kind of proceed and arbitrarily decide to create a rook piece at this point. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to create a board coordinate, and then I'm going to create a rook, and I'm going to test that I can add a rook to the board. And the first reason this is going to fail is because there's no such thing as rook, so I'll have to go and define that before we go any further. So I'm going to add the rook to the coordinate in question. That's not going to work because I'm going to need to declare that class, which I'll use CodeRush to do. I'll get rid of this constructor, and then I'll actually, right off the bat, because this isn't where I would want this test for convenience anyway, I'm just going to add it into the production folder along with the other production classes. Here's my trick again of giving it a goofy name, since I'm just going to paste it in, and then I'll use rename file to match type, and for me that tends to be quicker than actually typing in the name, especially when it's a name that's longer than rook, you know, service or some kind of complicated version of a service or something. So what I'm going to do now is that I'm going to go back to my test, which at this point should be, oh, excuse me, I'm going to need to, because we've got an inheritance situation here, I'm going to need to kind of square this away. At the moment, I got it defined by having rook inherit from pawn. That's obviously not what I want, and there's going to be another test that needs to be written in order to make that happen. But I'm back to passing. So the question here is, what do we do in order to goose this along a little bit more? So I'm going to define another class here, and this is going to be a rook test. And then I'm going to start defining functionality on rook. And so what I'm going to do is write kind of a stupid test here, just because I want to address rook and its inheritance structure. And I think I've got a way to do that. And what's even more important to me at this point is not only do I have a way to do that, the way to do it is kind of stupid, but I'm going to lay the groundwork for another test that I'll probably write later. So I don't really mind writing a stupid test if I know that I'm going to come back to it shortly and make it smarter. It's kind of a double entry bookkeeping sort of thing between your production code and your test code. You are improving both pieces of code as you go. You're refining them, you're eliminating duplication and all that sort of stuff. So I'm going to write a test basically that the constructor of rook results in a type that doesn't inherit from pawn. That's kind of contrived, but it's going to get the job done. So I'm going to say, well, if I create a rook, it's not an instance of type pawn. And then that's going to fail because right now it is. And it'll give me something I can go make green. And that's how I'll get out of this inheritance mess. So I'm going to write something here as a note to myself because I really don't like this. And there's always the temptation to leave stupid things that you do in the code base, as in like, yeah, I'll fix this later. And then there's a tendency of people to say, yeah, okay, sure, it's going to be in there forever. I'm not going to let that happen. If you do this, if you goose the process in this way, you have to make sure you're documenting that you don't want to leave stupid things in your code. All right, so now the code is no longer compiling. I'm going to look at the output messages to see why. And the reason that it's not compiling here is because the rook class is not implementing the abstract method. I was sort of playing around with CodeRush there to see if I could figure out how to get that to happen. There's probably a way, but I don't know it off the top of my head. So I am going to have to do a little bit of work here in order to get this going. So the first thing I'm doing is kind of cleaning up the references in board, where the new inheritance structure is forcing me to kind of change the way things are. And one thing I should mention too is that if you write a failing test that kind of hits the tip of the iceberg and results in you having to go and change a lot of types in a lot of places, that's okay. You just need that hook in to get things read. And then if it takes a bit of work to make them green, then it takes a bit of work. You're doing the simplest thing you can to make them green, but once you have red, it's perfectly valid that you might have to do a lot of things to get green. So I am going through and I'm actually changing a bunch of things, both in the test code and in the production code, in order to get the green dots to go from faded back to dark, which will tell me that I'm now compiling again. And finally, the problem that I mentioned, which is that this needs to implement the base class method that's abstract. I'm again floundering for a way to do that automatically. But I go and I find that Visual Studio is telling me to do it. So I think I'm good. I have a non-covered test method. I'm going to go check to see if I'm building. Ncrunch seems to think that this is okay, and I seem to remember being a little confused as to why this code wasn't being called, so I'm going through Ncrunch here and looking to see if I can find any non-passing tests or anything after being a bit flummoxed by this, but I believe that I eventually figure it out. Probably didn't help that I was getting sort of vestigial non-compiling messages there. So I see what's going on is that I still have some, I guess, the stuff on the right, the squigglies, and what's telling me from Visual Studio Power Tools that I'm not compiling seems to be out of sync and that there's not an actual problem. So I'm just going to move on. And I'm going to try to make this a little less stupid. So I've changed the containing class from constructor to get moves from, because I'm no longer writing an obtuse test of rook's constructor. I want to test an actual behavior from this method that's throwing not implemented exception. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that the getMoves method for rook should return an empty collection. Clearly that's not what we want it to do, but it's closer to what we want it to do than throwing not implemented exception. So once I'm done kind of fumbling around with my commas and such here, I'm going to have a failing test. And we should see everything go red here. Yep. And the reason being that's throwing an exception. So let me go to this method and just do the dumb thing here, and I'll return the empty collection to get this test going green. And now, kind of to recap, we've actually, through writing some kind of silly tests, we've wound up getting to a slightly less silly test, although it's still a silly test, and we've created this inheritance structure from going from using pawn for everything to now we've got rook and piece as the superclass for rook and pawn, which is important. One might argue that I should have done that earlier since there was some violence and flubbing about a bit to try to get the refactoring done, but I kind of just roll along with things as I think of them, crossing them off my list, and sometimes you wind up backtracking a bit. It's just a question of what you're thinking of and what you feel comfortable with at any given moment. So one thing that occurs to me now in the stream of consciousness that is this sort of approach is, here's a problem I could solve. It's probably easier than the other random special pawn moves, which is, for the first move, a pawn can actually move 2 spaces. So what I'm going to do is first I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to define some things here that I'm probably not going to worry about just now as this list gets a little longer. For instance, production code, not in its own project. I recognize that's something I need to do, but I'm probably not going to do that for a while. It's convenient not to for now. So let me move that over and create this designation. And I might later put the en passant and some other sort of real specialized things in there. I picked an obvious piece to start with in pawn because it's the simplest from a real politic chess perspective, but it actually is one of the more complicated pieces from a movement perspective. So I might defer some of that till later. What I'm doing now is knocking out some code rush issues. One thing I think I'd mention is that if you're big on coding standards and the like, I would advocate that you get a tool like CodeRush or ReSharper or even use something like StyleCop. Gamify these sorts of things that you want done right. If you see the way that these usings that I'm not actually using look, it's kind of annoying to me, so I have a tendency to clean them up, whereas I normally don't care at all about that. So you can definitely have better results for enforcing coding standards if you gamify and make it ugly when people don't follow them. So that aside, I am now implementing the 2 moves for the first move for pawn. So I'm going to create a new pawn, and I'm going to get its possible moves from this starting position. And I want to assert that there are 2 of them. Or I should say I want to assert that the possible moves contains the 2-4 move. So I want to say that possible moves has any board coordinate where the board coordinates x is the same and the y is 4. Now that is not currently pawn's functionality, so I need to make this test true. Well, here's a really easy way to do that. I'll just add another line to return, and if you're not familiar with the yield and deferred execution in C#, I would seriously suggest familiarizing yourself with it. It's a very powerful concept that I'm not going to go into right now. But what I am doing now is returning 2 board coordinates in that method. So that's not really good enough because if it isn't the first move for this pawn, this shouldn't be possible. Now, put aside for a moment the fact that a pawn at this coordinate couldn't possibly have moved because of how pawns work, but let's say we plopped it on the board in the 1-2 space and then moved it up one somehow in some kind of exercise, strange board, non-chess rules or something. Let's just say we did that. Well, then we don't want it to be possible for this pawn to move 2 spaces since it's already moved. So want to say the possible moves, or get moves from, does not return 2-4 when past 2-2 if the piece is already moved. So I'm going to create a similar kind of setup here, but in order to do this, we're going to have to define the actual has moved concept as we go. So actually, before I do that, one thing I'm going to do is something you'll see very commonly in my approach to test-driven development, which is I'm going to create this target. I don't like the fact that I was starting to type that method. I was typing var pawn equals new pawn again. I see that in 2 tests already, and that's too many. So while everything's green, I'm going to create a refactoring where I get rid of that piece of duplication. I know it probably seems a little nitpicky, but all of this adds up to not only time savings over the long haul, but non-duplication of the code, which I cannot overemphasize how important that is. Whether it's test code, whether it's production code, you don't want to duplicate things. It's death by 1,000 cuts if you do. So I'm getting rid of this line of code, and it's going to make my next test easier to type. And another thing that I would add is that you'll see, even if it's duplicate code, I very frequently don't copy and paste. I let myself feel the pain of typing things over and over again, because that's a smell, and it tells me that I can make something better. Copy and paste is like spraying cologne on that smell. It makes it more tolerable, but it doesn't do away with the problem. So I'm going to set target.hasMoved to true, and that's going to be a problem because, well, that property doesn't exist. So now it exists, and the test is compiling again, as you can see by the dots going green. So I'm going to go back, target has moved is true, and I'm going to get these possible moves, and then I'm going to assert that the thing I'm talking about in the previous test, this board coordinate where x is 2 and y is 4, we don't want that to exist anymore since this pawn is moved. But that's going to fail because there's no such check in the method, and there it fails as expected. So let's go back to this method and introduce a condition above this second yield return. So if has moved is false, then we return this particular coordinate, and only in that situation. Now, it'd probably be better if has moved were up on piece, and that's something we'll probably get to later, but I'm going to mark this item green for now, and I'm going to add in any kind of last-minute thoughts that I have here, such as figuring out where has moved gets set in the flow of things. And then at that point, I think I'm going to call it a session for now, so check back with me next time.